I gave my daughter a rare painting for Christmas, an original piece I had cherished for nearly half my life, and she looked at it as though I had handed her a moldy sandwich. She called it trash, not metaphorically, not jokingly. She said the word out loud, wrinkling her face as if the paint fumes offended her very soul. 7 days later, that same trash sold at an auction house for a sum that made the room go silent. $130,000 to be precise, though the final hammer sounded loud enough to wake the ancestors. Before the story continues, before the auction, the fallout, and everything that followed, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It really helps support stories like this. When my daughter found out, she didn't become embarrassed. She didn't apologize. She didn't even laugh it off. She became furious. Furious at me. That moment became the first crack in the foundation of a war I never wanted but damn well finished. But before I take you through everything, the disrespect, the greed, the unraveling of family ties, the secrets hidden behind old frames, and a lesson I learned too late, allow me to step back to the morning it all began. Because this story did not start with money. It started with love, and a gift meant to mean something. The crimson and silver wrapping paper I had spent nearly half an hour smoothing, folding, and taping tore apart in 3 frantic pulls. It fluttered to the floor, landing across my living room rug like discarded tinsel. My daughter, Maribel, stared at the painting inside with the same expression she used to give me when she was a teenager, and I asked her to clean her room, a mixture of boredom and mild disgust. "What is this?" she asked. My living room felt suddenly cold, colder than the year the old furnace quit, and I slept in flannel layers, swaddled like an elderly burrito. "It's a painting," I said softly. "Late 19th century Provençal piece." I thought, "It's so dark." She held it at an angle as though light might magically reveal a better version. "And the frame looks ancient." "Dad, we're doing a clean, modern look now. This belongs in some dusty attic." Her husband, Dominic, who rarely looked up from his ever-buzzing smartwatch, finally glanced at the gift and gave a polite half-smile. "Babe, maybe be a little kinder? It's the thought that counts." "The thought of what?" She cut back. "Turning our home into an antique store? This looks like something you'd see leaning against a fence at a yard sale." I felt my throat tighten, not from anger, but something far heavier. I had spent my dawn hours making cinnamon pull-apart bread, brewing the good coffee, and laying out a breakfast spread worthy of a holiday morning. None of it had been touched. They arrived late, complaining of being exhausted. But nothing stung nearly as much as watching her prop the painting against the couch like it was a bulky package she intended to return. "We can't use this," she said. "Maybe you can donate it. Or, I don't know, give it to someone who likes old stuff." My heart sank, but my voice didn't betray me. "I'll hold on to it," I said, and I meant it in more ways than she realized. "If you're ready, I'll tell you how that painting, dismissed as worthless, became the spark that burned through every illusion I had about my daughter." I carried the painting to my studio at the end of the hallway, a place no one in my family ever visited unless they needed something from me. The moment I closed the door, the quiet felt like a balm. Morning light slipped through the tall window, glimmering across the canvas as though the sun itself knew its worth, even if my daughter did not. I set the painting on my drafting table and peeled away what remained of the torn wrapping paper. The colors breathed again. Lavender fields swaying under a summer sky. Brushstrokes deliberate and alive. Hints of gold threaded between cool purples. Techniques most people wouldn't notice, but I had spent 4 decades appraising art. I knew the fingerprints of genius when I saw them. This was not clutter. This was not trash. This was a work of beauty painted by Etienne Moreau, one of the lesser-known impressionists whose market had quietly surged over the years. Maribel had glanced at it for all of 3 seconds before dismissing it. I traced a finger along the edge of the frame. I had purchased in 1996 from a private estate auction in San Francisco. A quiet room, a small crowd, a moment I still remembered more vividly than many birthdays. Back then, I paid $15,000, adjusted for inflation and the current market. Well, my daughter had just called a small fortune old junk. I should have felt angry. I didn't. I just felt tired. My phone sat on the corner of the desk, screen dark. I tapped it awake, hesitated, then scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I knew would change the course of this holiday. Ms. Clarissa Wynn, Aurora Fine Arts Auction House. I hovered my thumb for a heartbeat too long, then tapped. 2 rings, then her crisp, lilting voice answered. Clarissa speaking. Clarissa, this is Harold Alden. A delighted inhale. Harold, it's been ages. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, I said. I have something you might be interested in for your early January catalog. Oh, what kind of something? Moreau, late 19th century. Provençal landscape. The brief silence on the line spoke volumes. Harold, she said quietly, tell me you're not joking. I rarely joke about art. Well then, she said, tone brightening, bring it in after the holiday rush. We'll schedule a private evaluation. How does the first week of January sound? Perfect. After the call, I took one long look at the painting. The quiet lavender fields seemed to shimmer as though relieved to be seen by someone who understood them. The drive to Aurora Fine Arts that first week of January felt surreal. I buckled the painting into the passenger seat, a gesture half practical, half sentimental, and drove through the crisp winter air toward the city's old arts district. Snow from a few days before clung to the corners of the sidewalks, glowing under the pale morning sun. Aurora's building stood like a fortress of glass and steel at the edge of the district. Inside, modern lighting reflected off polished floors, displaying pieces worth more than most cars. Clarissa greeted me in the lobby wearing her signature charcoal blazer and thin-frame glasses that made her look like she could spot a forgery from a mile away. She guided me to a private space where she unwrapped the painting carefully, reverently. Her breath hitched. Oh, Harold, this is magnificent. For 30 minutes, she inspected every detail, the pigments under ultraviolet, the signature strokes, the canvas aging, the provenance documents I provided for my archives. Finally, she set down her magnifier and looked at me with eyes bright as polished silver. The market for Moreau has soared these past 2 years. Based on comparables, I'm thinking a low estimate of 120 to 140,000. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, though something warm stirred in my chest. Not because of the number, because someone saw what I saw. Shall I prepare the consignment contract? She asked. Yes, I said. Let's do it. And just like that, the painting my daughter despised began its journey toward the moment that would unravel everything between us. Aurora Fine Arts scheduled the piece for their winter prestige auction, held on the second Thursday of January. The morning air was sharp, the kind that makes even breathing feel like a decision. I wore my slate gray suit, the one my late wife always said made me look like a retired senator, and sat quietly in the back row of the bidding hall. The room buzzed with the murmurs of collectors, dealers, and phone agents perched like hawks along the mezzanine railings. Clarissa caught my eye across the room and offered a subtle nod that said, "This is going to be a moment." Moreau's landscape was Lot 51. When the auctioneer reached it, his voice shifted, an unmistakable tone used when something special crossed the block. Ladies and gentlemen, up next, a late 19th century Etienne Moreau Provençal landscape, extraordinary condition, impeccable provenance. I watched the room change. Postures straightened, brows lifted, several paddles hovered, already anticipating the opening number. Shall we begin at 60,000? 3 paddles rose before he finished the sentence. 65, 70, 75. The numbers climbed like a fever chart. 80, 90, 95. A phone bidder from Montreal joined the fray. A private dealer from Santa Barbara countered. A woman in the front row raised her paddle with a confidence that suggested she did not intend to leave empty-handed. Clarissa glanced back at me, a spark in her eyes. 110, 120, 125. The tension rippled across the room like heat off desert stone. At 130,000, the auctioneer raised his gavel. Fair warning, the last opposing bidder hesitated, an infinitesimal pause, and then lowered his paddle. Sold, the auctioneer declared, striking the gavel with a crack. For 130,000 to paddle 407. Applause swelled, soft but genuine. A few collectors shook my hand, offering polite congratulations. I accepted them with the calm dignity my profession had trained into me over 4 decades. But inside, I felt something between vindication and sorrow. I left the gallery without fanfare, the winter sun reflecting off the hood of my car as though the world itself approved. I should have known the peace wouldn't last. The message arrived before I even reached home. My phone buzzed once. A screenshot, sent by my daughter's friend, whether intentionally or by accident, I still do not know. It was the auction result newsletter from Aurora. Lot 51, Etienne Moreau, final sale, $130,000. Underneath it, a second message from Maribel. Dad, call me now. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone was vibrating nonstop, call after call, each more relentless than the last. Marivid, Dominic, even her mother-in-law, who had not spoken to me in 2 years. I let every call go to voicemail, not out of revenge, out of self-preservation. But when the 8th call lit up my screen, I finally answered. Maribel didn't even say hello. You sold it? She shrieked. The painting I gave back to you? The one that was in my Christmas gift. I parked the car slowly, deliberately, placing the gear into park as if giving myself time to find my voice. You didn't give it back, I said calmly. You rejected it. I didn't reject it, Dad. I just said it wasn't our style. You called it trash, Maribel. A breath. A sound like disbelief mixed with outrage. That doesn't mean you can sell it. You owe me half that money. Ah, there it was. Not sorrow, not shame. Entitlement. And I realized, in that quiet moment inside my parked car, that this auction was merely the beginning of a conflict I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. Not because of the painting, not because of the money, but because my daughter believed she had lost something that had never belonged to her in the first place. She arrived at my door within the hour, hair pulled back, face flushed, a storm wrapped in a designer coat. Dominic trailed behind her with that same patient, mildly annoyed look he wore when our children asked for extended curfews. You sold it, she said without preamble. Her sentence landed like a thrown plate. You rejected it, I replied. I set my coat on the chair behind me, as if preparing for a conversation that I suspected would be a battle. We want to cut, Dominic said, hands in his pockets. Half. It's only fair. You insisted you didn't want it. You suggested donating it. Our aesthetic, Maribel added, voice trembling between wounded and entitled. You can't just take something that was given to me and profit from it. I felt the old muscles of patience flex. Years of appraising, negotiating, and calming angry bidders had tempered me. I had handled worse auctions than this. I had never had to handle this particular kind of greed at my own dining table. Maribel, I said slowly, a gift, when refused, reverts to the giver. It was mine to do with as I please. Her face crumpled, not with remorse, but with calculated hurt. That's not how it works. If you sell my gift, that money is at least partly mine. We were counting on it. There was again. Counting on it. The phrase sounded like a verdict. Counting on inheritance is not a plan, I said. It's a hope built on someone else's life. Dominic's expression darkened. We could get a lawyer. She had a lawyer on speed dial before the wine had even been poured. Of course she did. Please, I said. I've dealt with lawyers for 40 years. She dialed anyway. The voice on the other end was brisk and practiced. Morton Fisher here. My client says you compromised her gift. We will be initiating proceedings unless we reach a settlement. I listened to the polite threats and then to the click of the call ending. For a moment, I let the noise of the television in the next room fill the silence, so I could think. I called Sid Parker. He picked up his phone faster than anyone else in the city. Sid has always been the kind of man who keeps time the way other people keep teeth, religiously. Harold, he said, I heard something on the grapevine. You all right? No, I answered simply. I sold a painting. My daughter is furious. There was a pause. How much? 130,000. A long whistle from the other end. Well, that explains the shallows turning into sharks. Bring me everything. Documents, receipts, bank records. We'll prepare for what's coming. We met at Sid's office 2 days later, surrounded by legal pads, maps of property lines, and the smell of coffee that had seen more courtroom mornings than I care to admit. He laid out a strategy with the quiet, efficient calm of a man who had fought similar battles and won more than he lost. Document everything, he said. Your generosity does not grant them rights, but they'll attempt guardianship, conservatorship, or claims of undue influence. We need airtight records proving the transfers, the gifts, the payments you made over the years. I told him about the rent equivalents, the utilities, the grocery transfers, how I kept receipts for everything. Sid's eyes narrowed in appreciation. You did well, he said. We can show a pattern of voluntary support, not an expectation of ownership. He suggested a few changes. Update the will, consider a transfer of partial title to Lemuel, my son overseas, and install minimal security measures. Cameras for the studio door, detailed logs of who accessed my office, and a professional inventory of the collection. It felt strange, cold almost, to talk about locks and deeds with the same warmth I reserve for canvases. But the world had shifted. What had been private had become public. On my way home, I stopped at the gallery to thank Clarissa again. She embraced me like a comrade. Right decision, she murmured. Some people don't see beauty unless they can put a price tag on it. I smiled, but the smile didn't reach the part of me that registers trust. That evening I walked the house, checking frames, counting smaller things I'd once thought insignificant. Teaspoons, old postcards, a silver ladle. I made a mental note to scan receipts tomorrow. If I wanted war, I would prepare. I was not sure I wanted to win. The week after Sid and I met, quiet became harder to trust. I decided to follow his advice and start with small, sensible changes. A single discrete camera on the studio door. A new safe deposit box across town for the most irreplaceable pieces. A stack of scanned receipts filed into a folder labeled proof. Neat, methodical, legalistic. It felt petty, almost paranoid, until I watched the footage on a cold Tuesday morning and found proof that made my stomach drop. There they were, Maribel and Dominic, gloves on, moving through my studio like burglars who believed sorrow justified hands. Dominic had a paperclip in his mouth. Maribel held a phone up like a torch, grinning as she photographed a small bronze on the mantel. The video showed Dominic try a paperclip on my desk lock, fumbling, sweating, and then finally waving to show his achievement as if it were a child opening a stubborn jar. He failed, but the attempt was enough. Enough to change the way I understood their intentions. I didn't call the police. I called Sid. When I played the footage for him, his jaw tightened. That's not curiosity. That's searching, he said. They're looking for something they hope will be worth more than a lifetime of favors. They were in my house for 3 years, I said. I fed their children, paid utilities when their rent lapsed, and yet they think the house is theirs by right. Sid rubbed his temples. Prepare for escalation. People who view a loved one as a bank account will try anything. False claims of dementia, lawyers who will file petitions for guardianship, shady appraisals planted to make your generosity look like a risk. A week later, an envelope arrived on the kitchen table. The headline on the enclosed letter read, Petition for Guardianship and Conservatorship. The paper smelled official. The words inside accused me of impulsive decisions, poor judgment, and a decline in cognitive function sufficient to warrant oversight. Their lawyer, Morton Fisher, had filed it under the excuse of concern. Concern, he said, for my well-being. I'll let the first shock roll through me, then the anger. The idea that my daughter, my own child, would authorize such a thing towards something fundamental. Sid arrived within the hour, briefcase already open. They can file the petition, he said, but they must prove your incapacity. We will need documentation, medical evaluations, testimony from those who know you professionally, evidence of your financial competency. I scheduled a cognitive evaluation. If they wanted a public trial in my mind, I would answer it with paperwork and patience. I would show the court the ledger of receipts, the bank statements, the email threads with galleries, everything that established me as the steward of my affairs, not a man adrift. Word spread fast in Santa Fe. Within days, a reporter called me at home. microphone already halfway down their throat. "Sir, can we ask you about the guardianship petition your daughter filed?" Came the recorded voice over the line. No one wanted to hear context. There is no nuance in a morning headline. I read the news item with Sid by my side. Our small community is quick to take sides and quicker still to gossip about decline and dignity. Some old acquaintances called to offer support. Others passed in the street with eyes that tried not to meet mine. The hearing date was set, less than 2 weeks away. Sid assured me the law would favor the competent, but the court of public opinion is a different beast. At night, I found myself standing in the studio with the painting wrapped and waiting. I had moved other pieces to the bank vault. The Moreau stayed at the gallery until the sale completed, but everything else, everything that might tempt a greedy hand, had to be accounted for. I thought about calling Maribel, about trying once more to talk. The footage, the lodged petition, the betrayal, these had shifted something irreparably. A child who would sue her father for control over his own life had crossed a line I could not easily step back from. Instead, I wrote letters to friends who knew me as an appraiser, to former clients who could attest to my judgment, to museum colleagues who understood provenance and patience. Sid attached affidavits. My life, once private and leisurely, was now a stack of defensive papers. On the eve of the hearing, I sat alone at my dining table with a cup of tea gone cold. Not because I feared losing everything, though that thought lingered, but because the person I had raised seemed to have been traded in for someone I barely recognized. And yet beneath the ache, a steady calm settled. I had cataloged decades of truth. Truth, when presented cleanly, is difficult to defeat. I only hoped it would be enough. The evaluation took place in a small clinic that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and antiseptic. A neat, professional room where the clock on the wall seemed to tick with a particular judgment. Dr. Sharon Bellamy greeted me with the kind of steady, unassuming warmth that made you want to tell her the whole truth. "Mr. Alden," she said, sliding a clipboard across, "we're just confirming your cognitive baseline. Nothing dramatic." I laughed once, a small sound that carried a history. Decades of cataloging brushstrokes, authenticating signatures, negotiating with dealers who try to sell modern prints as lost masters. "I've spent my life proving things are what they say they are," I told her. "I'll prove I am, too." She asked the standard questions, a mix of calendar time, simple arithmetic, memory tasks, and those odd drawing exercises that always reminded me of Dolly's clocks. I drew the clock. It did not melt. It looked like a clock my mother would have understood. When she asked me about recent financial decisions, I told the truth. I had donated a portrait to the museum. I had sold a painting because my daughter had rejected it. I had cared for family members in ways that were quiet and sustained. I did not mention the camera footage. I had learned that sometimes evidence is best used when placed carefully in the hands of the right people. After 3 hours of tests, Dr. Bellamy walked me to the reception area and said, "Mr. Alden, results are within normal limits for your age cohort. You passed well." Relief made a small, private hollow in my chest. Not triumph, just the sort of calm that settles when a storm misses your house. The news spread faster than I expected. Within the week, the small paper ran a short item. No sensational headline, but the townsfolk liked to whisper. Calls came from old colleagues offering support. Some neighbors dropped by with casseroles. Clarissa sent a brief note. "They cannot touch what you competently manage. Keep your head up." Then, in a turn that felt almost theatrical, the petition was withdrawn the day before the hearing. Morton Fisher's office phoned Sid with a terse message. "We are withdrawing the guardianship petition pending further investigation." No apology, no discussion, just a legal retreat. I should have thought the crisis was over. They were not finished. The morning after the withdrawal, someone attempted to force my studio lock. A locksmith later told me they had used a borrowed key, one that did not work the first time. The door opened that night for them because of carelessness, mine, not theirs. I had left an inner latch accessible during a previous showing. That mistake was enough. Maribel and Dominic stood in my studio doorway with eyes that had lost the softness of family, replaced with a gleam like people who have been taught to see the world in bank balances. "Where is it?" Dominic demanded. "Where's the real portrait? You swapped it." You gave the museum a fake. Maribel's voice was clipped, sharp. We had it appraised. It's a reproduction. You lied to us. Where's the authentic painting? We know you have it. Their accusations hit like cold water. I did not flinch. I had anticipated outrage. I had not anticipated the fast, practiced cadence of entitlement. You accuse me of defrauding a museum? I asked slowly. You accuse me of dishonor? Dominic stepped closer, voice low, a dangerous blend of desperation and bravado. We have people willing to prove it. Appraisals. Tests. You can't keep everything secret. They rifled through drawers, pulled open boxes, and searched through albums with the frantic focus of those who have been told the world owes them more than it has given. I spread documents on the coffee table. Receipts, auction records, a scanned invoice from 1996 for the San Francisco sale. I watched their faces as facts landed like stones in a still pond. You sold that other portrait years ago, I said. It's how I bought this house. I told you a story, and you chose to hunt for treasure rather than listen. Maribel's fingers trembled over a paper. This says you sold a painting for $750,000 in 2005. She read, then reread. Confusion wrestled with something harder, hope morphing into anger. Where's the rest? She whispered. Where's our share? You were never promised anything, I said. You were given a home and support. You call my gift trash. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of our words. They wanted a fortune and had instead found evidence of choices made long before their claims. Their faces revealed a new strategy forming. If they could not find the $1 million painting, they could at least allege deceit. And in that tilt, I understood the path would get darker before it cleared. The days after their frantic accusation unfolded like a series of rehearsed scenes, each one more desperate than the last. I found myself waking earlier, brewing coffee with the solemnity of an old monk, walking through each room of my house as though it were a museum of everything I had built, loved, and protected, and everything they now believed belonged to them. One morning, I discovered the portrait of my great-grandmother, an ornate reproduction I had purchased from a small artisan workshop in Taos. Crooked on the wall again. A tiny detail, but unmistakably deliberate. The frame had always hung straight. The angle was new. Someone had been in the living room, searching. I straightened it with a sigh. Not because of the disrespect, but because of what it told me. They weren't done hunting. Not for love. Not for reconciliation. For treasure. The phone rang before I reached the kitchen. A museum staffer, Marcus, a young assistant curator with large dreams and heavy student loans, requested a follow-up confirmation regarding the portrait I had donated. His tone felt slightly off, overly formal. Mr. Alden, he said stiffly, we received an inquiry from your daughter about the piece. She asked for additional insurance documentation. My daughter has no authority over my donations, I said. He hesitated. She insisted she was acting on your behalf. A cold clarity formed in my chest. Not shock, not anger, but resignation. They would use every angle they could find, every crack in the system, every person who could be manipulated. I thanked Marcus, hung up, and made a decision. It was time to take the real portrait, the genuine, irreplaceable painting, and move it again. I had kept it hidden behind a tall cabinet in my studio, wrapped in protective material, protected behind layers of harmless clutter. I retrieved it, laid it gently across my work table, and peeled back the fabric to reveal the truth. The colors glowed with a quiet luminescence. Soft ochres, delicate blues, the mastery of an artist whose name was known only in circles that still cared about precision. The genuine piece was worth well over $1 million, more now than when I'd purchased it decades before. It belonged not to the market, but to the memory of a family that once valued heritage over greed. I took photos, front, back, the documentary records, my signed agreement with the museum indicating that the real portrait will be transferred only upon my death. A note in my handwriting. This one stays hidden. The world will see it when I'm no longer here to argue about heirs. I sent the images to Sid. He responded immediately. Excellent. Document everything. Move the real piece to a vault. So I drove across town to my bank. Snow had started that morning, thin and quiet. The vault manager recognized me. Small towns keep memories the way archivists keep files. We authenticated everything, updated my inventory, and placed the portrait in the climate-controlled safety deposit box reserved for only the most irreplaceable items. Returning home, I expected quiet. But quiet does not always mean peace. That evening, while I warmed a bowl of soup on the stove, raised voices echoed upstairs, my daughter and Dominic again, arguing loudly in my guest room, unaware I had returned early. Through the floorboards, I caught fragments. He's obsessed with that painting. Worth a fortune. He'll slip eventually. We need to be nice. That's the only way. Wait him out. When he passes, we get everything. The last line stabbed sharper than anything they'd said to my face. Not because of the greed. I had expected greed. But because they spoke of my death as though it were a time frame, a date on a calendar, an inconvenience awaiting resolution. I stepped away quietly, letting the soup cool. I could have confronted them. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I went to my studio, locked the door, and breathed. Let them plan, I thought. Let them count imaginary coins. Let them chase ghosts in gilded frames. Because the only truth they would find is the truth I allow. 2 days passed before the next escalation. Quiet, deceptive days where the frost-painted mornings looked almost peaceful. But peace, I had learned, was often just the absence of noise before a new storm. I was trimming the dry ends of my rosemary bush near the side porch when my phone buzzed. A message from Sid. "Harold, need you to call me. Something's brewing." I dialed immediately. He answered before the first ring finished. "Harold, they hired a private investigator." "A private investigator?" I repeated slowly, as if the words were in another language. "Yes, a man named Frank Morse. He's cheap, sloppy, but he's persistent. He's been asking questions around town, quietly, but not quietly enough. He's digging into your estate transfers, your donations, and, most notably, your paintings." For a moment, I felt a coldness settle beneath my ribs. Not fear, disappointment. "How far will they go?" I asked quietly. "As far as you let them," Sid said. "But listen, this investigator has already made contact with someone at the museum. A junior staffer. Someone vulnerable." My mind flashed to Marcus, the assistant curator with the student loans and the timid voice. "They bribed him?" I asked. 2,000 in cash. Enough to make him curious, not enough to make him careful. He examined the donated portrait privately, and, well, he realized it was not worth what the old appraisal suggested. My breath stilled. "Good," I said. "That was the intention." "Yes," Sid said, "but they misunderstood the truth. They believe you swapped the real portrait and kept it hidden. They're convinced you defrauded the museum." A bitter laugh escaped me. "They accuse me of dishonor while ransacking my studio like jewel thieves." "They're desperate," Sid replied. "And desperation clouds judgment. Prepare yourself." I hung up and returned inside. The house felt different suddenly, lighter, as though it understood the truth better than the people who lived in it. Later that evening, a knock sounded at my front door, sharp, impatient. Not the friendly tap of neighbors. The kind of knock that demanded something. Maribel and Dominic stood there. Maribel's face was streaked with mascara. Dominic's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought the tension alone might crack a tooth. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me before I even invited her in. Dominic followed, pacing. "We know what you did," he said. "You tricked the museum. You tricked us. You switched the paintings. The real one is here somewhere." I closed the door with deliberate calm. "And you based this accusation on what?" Maribel shoved her phone toward me. On the screen was a message from Marcus, poor, foolish Marcus, who had confessed in text that the portrait was a reproduction. "You lied," she said. "You made us think it was worthless. But we know it's valuable. The appraiser said so. Christie said so." I nodded. "Christie said so 20 years ago." I reminded them. "The painting you're referring to, the $1 million piece, was sold. In 2005. The funds were used to buy this house." "You're lying," she snapped. "You kept it. I know you did. Why else would you install cameras? Why else would you hide things?" We saw the appraisal. I took a breath, steady and long, the way a man breathes before delivering a verdict. "You saw a document you were never meant to see." You misinterpreted it. You built a fantasy. And now you're breaking into my home, trying to make your fantasy real. Dominic slammed a fist into his palm. We will search everything. We will not be cheated out of what's ours. It is not yours, I said quietly. None of it is. Not the house. Not the art. Not the inheritance you imagine. Maribel's face twisted, anger giving way to something almost childlike, confusion mixed with heartbreak. You're choosing them over us, she whispered. I blinked. Them. The museum. Your lawyer. Your son across the ocean. Everyone but us. I studied her for a long moment. My dear, I said softly, I am choosing the truth. Something you stopped choosing a long time ago. Silence filled the room like heavy smoke. Then Dominic grabbed her arm. Come on, he muttered. We'll figure something else out. They left without another word. The door shut. The house exhaled. And I realized then that confrontation was no longer the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing my daughter believed the lie she had built more than the father she once trusted. The day after their confrontation, I found the courage to check the security footage from the previous night. Part of me didn't want to know. There is a special kind of grief in watching those you love behave like strangers. But clarity, I reminded myself, is better than comfort. The screen glowed softly in the dim light of my studio. I pressed play. The footage showed Maribel and Dominic waiting until I went upstairs. Then, with motions honed by repeated attempts, they moved through my studio, opening drawers, peering behind cabinets, photographing anything with an ounce of patina. At one point, Maribel lifted my late wife's jewelry box, cheap, sentimental costume pieces, and photographed them as if she had uncovered a vault of sapphires. She placed each item back carefully, not out of respect, but because people seeking treasure never wanted to stir the illusion that it still might be there. I watched the timestamp crawl across the screen. 2 hours of relentless searching. 2 hours of rummaging through memories they didn't understand. 2 hours of hoping to find riches where only sentiment lived. When the footage ended, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. It wasn't the violation of property that hurt. It was the violation of trust, the one thing more fragile than paint on canvas. Sid called shortly after noon. You need to come in, he said. Time to finalize the transfer. The transfer? I repeated. Yes, the house. 50% to Lemuel. If your daughter attempts to seize control or file another petition, having joint ownership protects you. I rubbed my face. The idea of splitting the house, a place where my children grew up, felt wrong. But the alternative felt worse. I'll be there at 4, I said. At Sid's office, documents waited on the polished table. Deeds, notarization forms, witness lines, and explanatory notes that read like a blueprint for preventing betrayal. Lemuel already approved electronically, Sid said. He trusts your decision. Of course he did. Lemuel had never asked for a cent. He never assumed entitlement. He lived a modest, happy life teaching English abroad, content with experiences rather than objects. Maribel, on the other hand, believed wealth was a birthright, an extension of her identity rather than an outcome of effort. I signed the documents. The pen felt heavier than usual. When the ink dried, Sid leaned back. Now your daughter can't claim the house belongs to her. She will need to negotiate with Lemuel for anything. I nodded slowly. Thank you. Prepare yourself, he said. They won't take this quietly. Sid was right. Because that evening, as the sky went lavender and dusk pooled across the yard, an unfamiliar car pulled up to the house, sleek, black, rented. Out stepped a man in a navy coat, holding an envelope like a weapon. Mr. Harold Alden? He asked. Yes. You've been served. He handed me the envelope and walked briskly back to the car. No pleasantries. No hesitation. Inside the envelope were the cold, typed words I had been warned might arrive. Petition for emergency conservatorship. Filed by Maribel Alden Wentworth and Dominic Wentworth. Reason: advanced age, diminished judgment, impulsive financial decisions, vulnerability to exploitation. The irony burned. I who had spent my life authenticating the minds and hands of artists, now being declared unfit to authenticate my own choices. My hands did not shake as I set the papers on the dining table. Instead, a calmness spread over me. Heavy, resolute, almost regal. This was no longer misunderstanding. This was strategy. This was deliberate. This was war. I poured myself a glass of water, simple, grounding, and called Sid. He answered immediately. They filed it, I said. He exhaled slowly. I'll be at your house in 20 minutes. Don't respond to them. Don't answer the door if they come. We'll handle this the proper way. When I hung up, I stared at the petition again. The words blurred, not from emotion, but from something older and deeper. Recognition. This wasn't about the painting anymore. Not about the house. Not about inheritance. This was about control, and who they believed deserved it. Above the quiet hum of the refrigerator, above the winter wind whispering against the window pane, one truth settled over me like snowfall. My daughter had stopped seeing me as her father. She now saw me as her obstacle. The next morning, the house felt like a courthouse, heavy, formal, and waiting for judgment. I brewed coffee as if it were sacred ritual, set out 2 cups though I expected to drink only 1, and sat at the kitchen table with the petition before me. The paper looked smaller now that it wasn't the first surprise, but the words still carried their weight. Sid arrived with files in a battered briefcase, in a calm that had seen too many storms to flinch at thunder. He sat, pulled the chair close, and opened his case as a captain opens a chart. We'll file an immediate response, he said. Object to jurisdiction. Challenge the facts. We'll demand proof. We'll call witnesses. You are competent, and we can prove it. His confidence settled me like warm wool. I thought of the museum, of Clarissa's satisfied nod when the hammer fell, of the painting wrapped and returned to its buyer. I thought of the thousands of cups of coffee I'd shared with friends and colleagues over a lifetime evaluation, of the ledger of receipts tucked in the bottom drawer, each entry a small act of generosity I never intended to catalog as evidence. Samay calls. He arranged for a neuropsychologist to prepare a report. He reached out to former clients who would testify to my acuity. He sent a polite note to the judge explaining we intended to contest the petition vigorously. Meanwhile, the house continued to be a theater for small, cruel performances. Neighbors who once waved offered cautious nods. The local paper ran another piece, facts this time, quoting the clinic report that had cleared me. But gossip is a stubborn weed. It blooms regardless. The day before the emergency hearing, I received an envelope from an unexpected sender. Lemuel. Inside, a single-type letter and a plane ticket. He had left a message, too, is to fly in as soon as he could. He wrote he would stand with me, not to disinherit, but to ensure nothing was taken from the house by force or by law. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into my breast pocket where it warmed against my chest. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled of old varnish and lemon oil, similar to my studio, yet colder. Sid wore his suit, as always, like armor. We walked into the courtroom together, the petition sitting heavy in a folder on the clerk's desk. Morton Fisher stood to present his case with the practiced rhythm of someone used to bending facts into shapes that looked like law. He spoke of concern, of impulsive sales, of sudden donations. He dotted his speech with phrases designed to worry the judge: diminished capacity, susceptibility to exploitation, erratic judgment. I listened. I kept still. When my turn came, Sid walked to the bench and spoke plainly. He laid out the ledger of transfers, the receipts of support sent to my daughter's household, the deposit confirmations for utilities and groceries, and the letters from museum professionals attesting to my competence and practice. He called witnesses, former clients, the head curator who had handled the Moreau sale, the doctor who had administered my evaluation. Each person spoke in clear, unadorned language about my work, my habits, my steady mind. My daughter's attorney paced and presented a terse, rehearsed witness, a young curator who testified they had been asked to re-examine the donated portrait. Their testimony hinted at confusion over valuation, but offered no proof of incapacity. The judge listened, his face a folded map of experience. He asked pointed questions. He examined the documents. He weighed the ledger against the petition. When the gavel finally came down, it was with a quiet, unequivocal sound. The court finds no basis for emergency conservatorship, the judge said. Petition dismissed. Relief is a strange animal, equal parts laughter and silence. Sid exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for months. I felt the weight in my chest shift, if only slightly. Victory, yes, but not the kind that heals. Outside the courthouse, Maribel waited on the steps like something caught in the rain. She looked exhausted and smaller than she had in my doorway. We did not speak. There were no words that could stitch the rent, and our relationship closed that afternoon. As we drove home, Lemuel called from the airport. He told me he would arrive that evening. He said nothing of judgment and little of advice. He said he would be there. That night, I sat at my studio window watching the streetlights bloom, thinking that legal victory is a shield, not a cure. The house felt safer, yes, but the distance between my daughter and me felt like an unbridgeable span of years and choices. I wondered whether, in the currency of human lives, there could be restitution that matched the cost. There's a certain sorrow that follows triumph when the prize is merely the right to be yourself. Lemuel arrived that evening just as the last blue thread of daylight slipped behind the mountains. When I opened the door, he stepped inside with the same quiet presence he had as a child, measured, perceptive, and carrying more understanding in his eyes than most adults manage in entire conversations. He embraced me without hesitation. Not a polite hug, a grounding one. "I'm here, Dad," he said softly. "Whatever happens next, we handle it together." The house felt different with him inside it. Less hollow, less strained. His presence filled the spaces grief had carved out. We sat at the dining table, drinking tea, jasmine for him, black for me, and discussed the day's hearing. I told him about the judge's dismissal, about Sid's steadfast defense, about the museum support. He listened with the patience of someone who knew anger would only worsen the wound. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "She's not thinking clearly. Fear makes people do foolish things." "She isn't afraid," I said quietly. "She's entitled." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, and I knew he understood that grief lived under my anger. Grief for the daughter I raised. Grief for the person she chose to become. Later, after he'd settled his luggage in the guest room, I walked through the house checking locks, the same way one checks a sleeping child's breathing, not out of paranoia, but care. That's when I noticed something new. The portrait reproduction, the ornate, gold-framed likeness of my great-grandmother, was crooked again. Not wildly so, just enough that a careful eye would see it had been touched. And this time, there was a tiny slip of paper taped behind the frame, barely visible unless you looked for it. I removed the frame from the wall and peeled the paper off. A note written in Maribel's hurried hand. "Appraise this immediately. 18th century. Could be worth 1.5 million. Do not touch. M." I stared at the note for a long time. Not angry. Not surprised. Just hollow. Let them believe, I thought. Let them chase shadows. I placed the fake portrait back on the wall with a precision I had perfected during 40 years of hanging irreplaceable canvases. Straight. Centered. Immovable. Behind me, Lemuel stood in the doorway, arms folded. "They've been here again," he said quietly. "Yes." He leaned against the frame of the doorway, studying the portrait the way an art student studies early masters, assessing technique, brushwork, trust. "It's a clever reproduction," he said. "No wonder they were fooled." "That's the tragedy," I replied. "They want to see value, not meaning." He nodded toward the hallway where the note lay discarded. "She's thinking like someone who believes she's owed a treasure." "Yes," I said, "and she'll keep digging until she realizes there's nothing left to find." Lemuel exhaled, long and steady. "What's your plan now?" I looked at the studio door, locked, secured, reinforced, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle between my shoulders. "Sid and I will finalize the transfer paperwork tomorrow," I said. "Half the house is legally yours now. They can't force entry. They can't claim residency. Not anymore." "And them?" he asked. I paused. A long pause. The kind that holds truth in its center. "I give them time," I said finally. "Time to confront what they've done. Time to accept consequences. Time to face their own lives without leaning on mine. And if they don't, I sipped my tea. It had gone cold. Then they'll learn the lesson greed eventually teaches everyone, I said. That some doors close forever. The house creaked, settling into its bones. Outside, the wind began to rise, quiet at first, then persistent, like a reminder that winter doesn't ask permission to arrive. As I turned off the lights and headed for bed, I understood something simple and painful. The legal battle was over, but the emotional one had just begun. The next morning dawned pale and wind-bitten, the kind of winter light that makes every color look diluted with sorrow, as though the world itself had been washed in cold water and hung out to dry. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and the windows carried a film of frost so thin it looked like breath held too long. Lemuel joined me for breakfast, toast, eggs, and the kind of quiet conversation that feels steadier than any argument, the kind of silence between sentences that comes not from avoidance, but from mutual understanding. We ate slowly, as if rushing might fracture the fragile calm we'd managed to salvage overnight. By midday, we were seated in Sid's office, the radiator clanking in its old metal shell like a tired soldier. Sid moved through the paperwork with methodical precision, each signature a reinforcement of boundaries that had needed shoring up long ago. Ownership transfer confirmed. Legal protections reinforced. Estate files updated, corrected, and sealed. Every document felt like armor, heavy, necessary, and a little sad. When we finally returned home, the snow had begun again. Not the furious kind, not the kind that stings the skin or blinds the eyes, but soft flakes drifting down in patient spirals. They landed on the walkway with a hush that felt almost thoughtful, as though the sky itself were pausing to consider how much more it could bury. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and instantly sensed something was wrong. A draft, a disturbance in the stillness, a quiet that felt tampered with. Homes have a way of holding their own breath after an intrusion. This one was no different. I walked into the living room and stopped dead. The reproduction portrait, the fake they had fixated on, was gone. Its place on the wall gaped back at me, a perfect clean rectangle where the paint beneath had been shielded from years of sun and smoke and time. The bare outline looked like a ghost of history, faint, accusatory, and deeply familiar. Lemuel's voice tightened behind me. They took it. Of course they did. I moved through the room slowly, like a man tracing a memory. The mantel next, small trinkets, antique frames, a pair of porcelain bookends, had been disturbed, not removed. Shifted slightly, tilted, handled. The kind of displacement that comes not from theft but from searching. They were here again, I murmured. They think they can force a story to be true just by wanting it badly enough. Lemuel exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Should we call the police? I shook my head. No, let them take the fake. Let them believe they've captured something valuable. Then, with a bitterness I didn't attempt to hide, sometimes illusion is punishment enough. We found a note on the dining table, written in the same hurried, angry script as before. We're taking the portrait to get a proper appraisal. You've lied enough. M. Lemuel ran his thumb beneath the bridge of his nose, a gesture of worry he'd inherited from his mother. Dad, this is escalating. They're not thinking clearly. I know, I said quietly, but this is their final grasp at a treasure that doesn't exist. Once they realize that there's nowhere else for their anger to go. I turned toward my studio and unlocked the door, half expecting, half fearing to find it ransacked. But everything inside was in order. The air smelled of oil paint and cedar, familiar and grounding. The real portrait was safely locked in the vault. The collection cataloged meticulously. Every receipt filed. Every piece accounted for. Yet I felt no triumph. Only a quiet, aching fatigue that settled into my bones like winter itself. Lemuel sat beside me as I lowered myself into my chair, the old leather creaking beneath me. Dad, are you all right? He asked. I'm tired, I said, staring at my hands. Tired in a way sleep can't fix. He nodded, something soft and understanding flickering across his face. Lemuel had always been the one who saw the world without needing it explained. Do you remember when Maribel was 8? I asked suddenly. His eyebrows lifted with a small, cautious smile. Which part? The summer she did that art camp at the community center, I said. She drew you me, and your mother standing under that crooked cottonwood tree. And she insisted the tree was purple because ordinary trees are boring. He chuckled softly. She got paint on her nose every single day. Yes, I murmured. She came home glowing with pride. That drawing hung on the fridge for 2 years. She'd show it to every guest like it was a masterpiece. We fell quiet, memory doing what memory does, tenderizing the past until it almost hurts. Where did she go, Lemuel? I whispered. Where did that little girl go? His hand settled on my shoulder, steady, reassuring. People change, Dad. Sometimes in ways we don't see coming. I nodded slowly. But greed eats the soul. I should have protected her from that. You did, he said. You raised her with love, with books and museums and stories. You taught her beauty and history. You gave her everything. But this path, he hesitated, then finished, she chose it. We sat in the studio for a long time, listening to the wind knot itself around the corners of the house, a moaning sound like an old instrument being tuned. The shadows stretched across the floor, lengthening as afternoon slipped toward evening. And then, a knock, loud, impatient, angled with accusation. Lemuel stood, but I lifted a hand. I'll handle it. I opened the door to find Maribel on the porch, hair wild, cheeks flushed, breath quick and sharp. The fake portrait was clutched awkwardly against her chest like a shield. Dominic hovered behind her, his expression taut with the certainty of a man who believes outrage is a virtue. We know what you did, Maribel spat, pushing past me without waiting for permission. Snowflakes clung to her coat and melted on the hardwood floor. You lied. The painting is worthless. Completely worthless. They told us it's a reproduction. Her eyes burned not with revelation, but with disappointment that the truth refused to bend in her favor. You tricked us, she said. You tricked the museum too, Dominic added, with a sneer he didn't bother to hide. What kind of person does that? I shut the door with deliberate calm, letting the latch click into place. The kind of person, I said softly, who no longer trusts his own daughter to recognize the difference between value and greed. Silence followed sharp, wounded, heavy. They stared at me, waiting for denial, for excuses, for a convenient villain to reassemble their broken narrative. Instead, I stepped past them and gestured toward the living room. Sit down. Both of you, I said. It's time you finally hear the truth. Because truth, once laid bare, is heavier than any canvas and far harder to carry. They sat opposite me on the sofa, Maribel, clutching the stolen reproduction like a child might cling to a frayed talisman. Dominic bristling with the sort of weary aggression that comes from years spent mistaking resentment for armor. They had planted themselves there as though the cushions were a courtroom bench and I, by a simple proximity, the accused. What they wanted was obvious, a confession that aligned with the story they had built in their minds. A story with a villain simple enough to hate. A story in which I was the greedy old man who hoarded riches while they stumbled through life in threadbare shoes. But instead of the narrative they hungered for, I gave them the truth. Listen carefully, I began. My voice came out measured and delicate, the way you hold your breath while moving a fine brush across a centuries-old canvas. The painting you found in the museum files, the one you're convinced I've locked away in my safe, was sold back in 2005. It brought in $800,000. I used that money to buy this house. It was a conscious, responsible choice. I did not steal anything. I did not hide anything. I managed my life. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the room like a taut wire. Maribel's face flickered through a dozen expressions: surprise, indignation, a flare of hope, then anger, and finally the slow, painful crumble of someone realizing their version of the past might not survive exposure to daylight. Her fingers tightened on the reproduction until the canvas warped slightly. You sold our heritage, she said. Each word was small, sharp, a pebble pitched to my chest. You sold what could have been our future. You were not promised it, I replied. You were given a home. You were supported. You called my gift trash and suggested I donate it to Goodwill. You chose to see price tags where there should have been memories. Dominic's hands curled into fists. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, jaw tensing with every breath. Then where's the rest? $800,000 doesn't just vanish. Where did it go? I opened the drawer of the old oak desk beside me and laid out the papers one by one, auction receipts printed in crisp, unforgiving typography, bank confirmations, the property transfer for the house, tax filings, letters from the museum acknowledging provenance and release. Each sheet was not simply proof, but a fragment of my life, a documented trail of choices made with the intention, however clumsy, of providing stability. You see, I said softly, everything is accounted for. This is not secrecy. It is transparency. I nudged the papers toward them, not aggressively, but with the quiet finality of a judge returning a verdict. Maribel read in silence, her eyes scanning back and forth with increasing desperation. At one point she paused, lips forming the number $800,000 as though taste-testing bitterness. "You could have told us," she whispered. "You could have shared it." "I did share," I answered. "I share the house you lived in, the years I fed your children, the nights I sat beside your bed when you were ill. I have given in ways that do not involve ledger lines." She recoiled as though the words had physical weight. "But we needed that money," she said, voice cracking. "We were drowning. And I helped," I replied. "When your rent fell behind, when the bills piled up, when Dominic lost his job, I paid what I could. I lent. I gave. But you mistook that for ownership. You equated care with entitlement." Dominic's search for anger faltered, replaced by a quieter hunger, a glint I had witnessed in men who measured worth exclusively by net worth. "You could have at least split it," he muttered. "Sell a piece, give us something." "I did not owe you a split," I said. "A gift once refused returns to the giver. You rejected the painting on Christmas morning. You called it trash. The memory hung between us, the torn wrapping paper." Maribel's offhand insult, Dominic laughing as though discarding art were a sport. I had swallowed that moment then. It rose now like smoke. Silence settled over the room, thick and deliberate. The fire in the hearth crackled with slow, steady pops, its warmth failing to soften the tension that gripped the room. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint hiss of fresh snowfall. The evening light dimmed, drawing long shadows across the hardwood floor, as though the house itself were exhaling. Maribel's shoulders trembled. The mask of righteous fury she had worn since stepping through my door slipped, revealing something more fragile: fear, yes, but also shame. "We had nowhere else to go," she said. "We needed help." "You had help," I repeated gently. "Help that I offered without condition." I paused, letting the air settle. "I'm not blind to your struggles. I have already arranged additional support, but I will not be robbed of my autonomy. I will not be treated as a piggy bank with a pulse." Her breath hitched. She lowered her gaze, letting the reproduction slide from her hands into her lap. The canvas edge scraped softly, a tiny sound that felt almost like an apology. The painting, a cheap copy of the one that had once lived in my possession, seemed suddenly too heavy for her. "Please," she said, not demanding, not bargaining, just pleading. "You're my father." The word struck with unexpected force. I breathed slowly and allowed myself to look at her, not at the anger, not at the desperation, but the woman whose childhood freckles I used to count on summer afternoons, the girl who once climbed into my lap to show me her drawings, fierce and proud. "You are my daughter," I said. "Nothing erases that. But your choices have consequences, and so do mine. Being your father does not mean dissolving myself." Dominic shifted, exhaling a breath that seemed to deflate him. His gaze slid to the papers, then to Maribel, then to me. For the first time since they entered the room, his expression held something like comprehension, unwelcome, perhaps, but real. There was no dramatic reconciliation waiting in the wings. No sudden tears that would wash away years of miscommunication and unmet expectations. Families rarely fracture dramatically. They erode slowly, the way a river wears down stone. And healing, when it comes at all, requires patience more than passion. We sat there, the three of us, with facts spread between us like cards on a table and truths heavier than any currency. Outside, the snow continued falling, a soft, persistent accumulation that muted the world. It settled on the roof like a benediction, impartial and gentle, indifferent to human conflict. Inside, the air felt still, as though the house itself were listening, waiting to see what shape our fractured ties might take next. For now, there was no bridge rebuilt, only the first hesitant stones placed at the edge of the ravine. And we sat quietly with that, not at peace, but not at war, breathing in the truth. They left 2 weeks later in a rented truck with more bravado than belongings. The street looked oddly small, without them, fewer shoes on the mat, fewer voices drifting through the walls. Maribel stood on the porch one last time, eyes rimmed red, clutching a crumpled list of rental applications. She opened her mouth, shut it, and then walked down the path without knocking. The house felt both emptier and cleaner at once. Not a victory, so much as a blank space where a long argument had finally ended. I walked through each room with slow hands, touching the backs of chairs, straightening a picture, noticing the small things that insist on being cared for. A chipped teacup, a child's drawing pin to the refrigerator, a faded postcard from an old trip. I kept them all. Sid called the day after the moving truck drove away. "You did the right thing," he said, not to flatter, but to mark the legal border he had helped draw. "You think so?" I asked. "I do." He hesitated. "You can, if you want, forgive the debts you recorded. It would look magnanimous." I thought about the ledger on my desk, the months of quietly covering rent, utilities, medicines. Letting go of the receipts would be easy paper-wise. The harder part was the message it sent. That evening, I took the ledger from the drawer, sat at the kitchen table, and crossed out the numbers one line, 2 lines, until the totals disappeared beneath a single sweep. I didn't send a note. I didn't forgive publicly. It wasn't a pardon so much as a release I needed for myself. Mercy, given without trumpet, feels truer. A postcard arrived 6 months later in a child's uneven scrawl. "Dad, I got a job. Thanks for not cutting me out. M." I pinned it next to the crooked crayon drawing from when she was 8. I felt a memory flicker paint on her nose, purple trees, a small, indomitable pride. I said nothing to anyone. I simply made more coffee, folded a new napkin, and sat on the terrace watching the sunset turn the mountains gold and then indigo. The house was mine to keep and to guard. The lesson had been costly. The cost was measured not only in dollars, but in what I had asked of my heart. Sometimes justice requires distance. Sometimes love waits, patient and unbranded, on a kitchen shelf. In the quiet that followed, life became gentler. I painted again terribly, joyfully letting the colors run where they pleased. Some evenings I walked past the empty spot where the fake portrait once hung, no bitterness left, only a kind of wry gratitude. Not every chapter ends in reconciliation. Some end simply in peace earned, steady, and wholly my own.